Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I want to start by thanking everyone at the Canopy Forum, the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, Justin and John in particular, to all the conference participants. I know for some of you, this is an ungodly hour in the middle of the night, almost in Singapore. To my colleagues from the South Asia Scholarly Activist Collective, who've really helped in getting this conference together, and the Carlos Museum, which is a lovely museum in Emory, and during the break, I will play some videos of some wonderful South Asian art that they have. So if I may, I'd just like to start by sharing some thoughts about how this conference came about. And that will bring into relief many of the intellectual and other debts I owe various people. So in a way, this is a homecoming for me in twice over, really. I graduated with my PhD from Emory in 2006, though not from the law school, but from an interdisciplinary department called the Graduate Institute of the Liberal Arts. Really a wonderful place. The Center for the Study of Law and Religion at the law school, however, was more of a home for me for practically all of those 6 years. And in that time, I had the privilege of working as a research assistant for Professor Abdullahi Annaim, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Law, on several projects, including initiatives of women, land and rights in Africa, Islam and human rights in different societies with majority and minority Muslim populations, and the relationship of Sharia, secularism, and the state. And the work was intellectually exciting in many, many ways, one of which was organizing and participating in workshops in Istanbul and in Bombay, Delhi, and Aligarh in India. And someday I'm going to write a paper about which city, Istanbul or Bombay, has worse taxi drivers, because I really thought I was, in cabs, and I really thought that was the end. I was going to die. And I also had the privilege of working with Anita Mann, who's the Director of Business and Operations and Finance at the center, which was another education in managing grants, keeping programs running, organizing events. So my gratitude to both of them as well for their support for this conference. Now, Professor Annaim's work spans many areas, from Islamic law or Sharia, including Islamic law or Sharia, human rights in global perspective, constitutional rights, land rights, and as I mentioned, the relationship of secularism, religion, and the state. And a central question that animates much of his work is the role of religion in public life. Related questions are, the issue of the many publics to which religion speaks, and the role of the state in mediating these different relationships. So his thinking and his contributions in these issues have been illuminating and challenging for me. And a conference on this topic centered on South Asia, it's the region, I cannot claim to know it well, but in relative terms, it's the region I'm least ignorant about, seemed to be, it's a small gesture of acknowledgement and thanks for his intellectual gift. So when Justin and I were conversing and he suggested doing an event, it seemed natural to do an event on this topic. And many conversations and many emails later, I am delighted to bring together an absolutely wonderful, remarkable group of scholars from a range of disciplines who address this issue of religion and its publics, this question in their work. And the scholars are from history, religion, media studies, law, and anthropology. And pardon me, in organizing the panels, one of the very pleasurable challenges I faced was, which paper to and which talks to place in which panel, because they were so rich and multifaceted. The papers then speak not just to their fellow panelists, the papers by their fellow panelists, but they really speak across panels as well. And I'm hoping we will have some of those conversations. And finally, in ways that none of us wishes were the case, the matter of religion and public life has taken a particularly ugly turn in South Asian contexts and deserves urgent attention. Literally as we speak, Hindu right-wing vigilante groups, and they're thugs really, though they call themselves activists, they are preventing Muslim women students from attending college in their hijabs, and they've been violent and snatched these hijabs off also. And the Karnataka High Court, in its learned wisdom, to use the idiom of Indian courts, has decided that the hijab is not essential to Islam. And yesterday, the same thing happened with a Sikh student with regard to their turban. So this conference just represents, again, a utopian hope that down the line or in some way we can recuperate those traditions of inclusivity, and the relationship of religions to their publics in South Asia can be pluralistic and polyphonic in the best sense of each term. So just, wrapping up, I just will take a couple of minutes more. I just want to share a couple of lines from a Philip Larkin poem called Water, which it's a poem I love. I mean, Larkin was a kind of piece of work, but the poem can be separated from his personality. And it starts with these lines, and I'll just read the first and last stanzas. It's a very, very brief poem. If I were called in to construct a religion, I should make use of water. And then he goes on to tell us why. And it ends with the most beautiful metaphor for religious coexistence and pluralism. And he says, and I should raise in the East a glass of water where any angled light would congregate endlessly. So I just hope that this is one congregation along intellectual lines on the issue of religion and its publics. And on that note, once again, I'd really thank everyone, and I look forward to 2 days of wonderful discussions. And we're a little early for the first panel, but we can proceed with it. Thank you so much.
Is this a cue for me, Rohit?
Oh yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to thank Rohit Chopra for inviting me to participate in what is and promises to be an incredible gathering of scholars across humanities and social sciences on an issue of critical importance, religion and its publics in South Asia. My distinct pleasure.
Sorry, Manan, I messed up. I should, in the transition, we're going to have a sequence of introductions. So I missed one. So I just want to step back in and just introduce Manan.
It's okay. I can do it.
Okay.
It's fine. It's all good. We're here as scholars and colleagues. It's perfectly okay. Thank you, Rohit. So I just wanted to say that it's my distinct pleasure to moderate the first session today. My name is Manan Ahmed. I am a historian. I teach in Columbia University. Generally, my work is organized around the early modern and medieval periods, and sometimes I talk about the Indian Ocean, though I've only stepped into it once, and that's hardly expertise. So today I wanted to welcome everyone to the first panel, which is on religion, caste, and power in South Asian publics, and what Rohit and our colleagues have managed to do is really bring an incredible array of scholars to think and reflect about this question today. I will go ahead and introduce all of our speakers, and they will appear and they will speak as they appear on the program. So first and foremost is Dr. Suraj Yengde, who is a scholar based at Harvard and Oxford universities. His upcoming book, Caste: A New History of the World, will be published in 2022. Next will be Dr. Audrey Truschke, who is an associate professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. Her research interests cover from pre-modernity into modern times, often emphasizing Hindu-Muslim interactions, cultural history, and the politics of the past. Following that would be Dr. Ananya Chakravarti, who is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University. Her first book, The Empire of Apostles, received an honorable mention for the Bernard S. Cohen Prize from the Association of Asian Studies. She's currently working on her second monograph on the Kunkan with the generous support of a NEH fellowship. And finally is Dr. Chinnaiah Jangam, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He holds a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and a postdoc from the International Center for Advanced Studies at NYU. He was awarded the Felix Fellowship for Doctoral Studies, the Henry Frank Guggenheim Dissertation Fellowships. His research interests include South Asian social and intellectual history, Dalits and anti-caste epistemologies, race, colonialism, gender, and translation. His excellent first book is Dalits and the Making of Modern India. Second book, Gabilam, a Dalit epic, is a translation of a seminal Dalit text in Telugu and will be published by Yoda Press in April 2022. Join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Suraj Yengde.
Thank you so much, Manan, for that extremely precise introduction and for the warm welcome. I want to really spend a couple minutes to really mention and acknowledge the work of my esteemed colleagues who I'm sharing this panel with, but also sharing the screen, and also acknowledge some of the audience members for their scholarship and activism, who have really courageously taken on so many challenges, personal as well as professional, but have not lost the energy and the direction that they were committed to. So, Rohit, thank you so much for putting us together. I mean, I just was admiring the patience you have to communicate so regularly, to keep updated. I would have lost it by time, and so it's really your commitment to a certain politics that you envision, which is rooted in democratic framework, that I really would like to uphold and acknowledge, for also your leadership. And we have seen how you are attacked and lacerated, not least by the people who are in India, but also outside India, who continue to animate the space of so-called diaspora and this kind of victim minority space. And so you're not alone here. I also share this space with my dear brother Manan Ahmed, whose excellent work. I mean, when he says medieval India, I was just feeling like that's what I want. That's what he does, and I just love the mix of this. Audrey, again, for all of your courageous work, I really extend my salutes, and my lovely brother, the historian of South Asia, Chinnaiah Jangam, who really is making me proud every time I read a text by him, which is not only resourced, but it is highly contentious to much of the scholarship that has been produced on South Asia. Brother even tells the Savarnas their position in his books when it comes to citations. This is by the non-Dalits who are trying to think about the Dalit cause, and I think that's the immense audacity that I want to celebrate. So the topic that I thought I should speak about is the Brahminical narrative which exists in the disguise of Hindutva, and it is very much. I would like to, when we speak about this, I would like to take you to North India, and if you will, the present day Pakistan, or the northwest provinces Punjab, when during the 1920s, an active caste movement. It can be categorized either anti-caste or as well as pro-caste. In some way, it can be called reformatory. In many senses, it is called emancipatory. In 1920s, the Arya Samajis are very much afraid by the new dawn of colonial census and the active lobbying of the Chamars and the group what we today identify as Balmikis started to fear that a new constituency would be developed eventually to identify itself as separate from the so-called making up of Hindu majoritarian view. Now, in many ways, the whole compass of identifying community and caste groups was flawed in many instances, but it was also helpful for many people. And the people who eventually embraced census found a reason to work within the categories. And in this case, we all know the 1880s census was very much predicated on someone who is not a Muslim, is a Hindu. And then slowly it eventually added who is not a Christian, is a Hindu. And as you can see, slowly, eventually, the purpose was through this Abrahamic faith-based distinctions that the diverse independent folk religion, native religious indigenities that comprise the vast breadth of India was going to be recognized, but through the Hindu canon. And partly people responsible for this were the early ethnographers who were the colonial administrators, especially James Hutton, who in spite of seeing the independent practices of different groups, forced this indigenous autonomous cultural religious groups into a category of Hindu. Now, mind you, the Hindu, as we call it today, Hindu was not really existing in the form that we see it today, very much fine, polished, refurbished, and brought to you as a made-up majoritarian consensus. And so the history is in the 1880s proper census. And then over the flaws, what we see eventually is the consciousness that has been given thanks to the colonial authority that some of the Dalit working class base and some who could escape and go to overseas found their liberal thought being sharpened much more critically, and then through liberal it had appeared through the Gadar movement, the radical shaping. In this we see Manguram Mogowalia as well as Sardar Udham Singh, who really bring a certain essence to the politics of nationalism, but rooted in the Dalit politics. Now, Dalit nationalism is also existing, which was yet to come, but there was a vision that we are not part of Hindus. And there was a movement led by the groups which we can identify as Chamars and Balmikis in an enormous amount, so much so that there was a counter propaganda to the Arya Samajis who were now doing the missionary work. Usually the idea of missionary is attributed single-handedly to Christians or Muslims when you go to the medieval period, but the Arya Samajis came across as one of the most uber missionary religion working with the Dalits, convincing them of attributing to their original faith. Now the problem here was, what of Hindu belonged to the Dalit community? The spiritual traditions were vastly different. The languages and the food they consumed was enormously on a different pole. And yet the necessity for identifying Hindu became a almost simultaneous contradictory view, but worked in complement to each other. At one side, it was a colonial apparatus, and the other side, it was the Arya Samajis. Now, both of them, in spite of knowing that these are not Hindus, wanted to force Dalit into the new made identity of the Hindus. Now, if Dalits are counted or meant to be counted as Hindus, where are the Hindu pantheons in their households? There were the Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh didn't exist within the Dalit households. They had their own traditions and culture. So to incorporate that, and this is where I really would like to appreciate the work of Vijay Prashad, who did in early 2000, where the idea of Balmiki is created, where Balmiki as the sanitation, the worker or the chudas, as today it's used as a slur, the people who are doing the sanitation work, they were given a icon in the name of Valmiki, not as an ancestor, but as someone you should model yourself upon. So when Valmiki contested that, there was a swift move to divert the attention and create an enemy in the Musalman. And they say the relegation of your status was because of the Muslim rulers who have not addressed the issue of untouchability. Partly that was true, but secondly, the Hinduization happened gradually, and this Hinduization was nothing but arming them, creating a mercenary force among Dalits. This work of close to 100 years worked out effectively well in various riots. But fast forward to the late 20th century during Babri, and as well as during the Godhra pogroms, the same manifestation of a Hindu majoritarian view was created, and Dalits and alongside Adivasis were recruited as mercenaries to work on behalf of the dominant caste agenda. Now, within this, what we need to understand is that the Hindutva narrative is a semiological transfiguration of the Brahminical social order, what Kanshiram would call as BSO, a Brahminical social order. So the telltale of Hindutva canon has disguised its original, and I emphasize, original purpose of Brahminism. Brahminism as a praxis and theoretical input is the crux of the Hindutva template that has embraced a philosophy of othering since its inception. Brahminism was always meant to maintain a sanitary identity, the identity of purity and impurity complex, and the concept of capital O, othering. And here othering just doesn't mean to other, but also create an animosity, enmity in the other person, is the origin where we can find within the Brahminism. Hindutva, to fully comprehend the status of Hindutva, we need a detailed political examination of Brahminism. And then we really need to apply modern day political lens to this project of Brahminism. Brahminism has hidden itself by being merely a philosophy of religion or spiritualism. And it has escaped the analysis of political philosophy, Ambedkar here, or in fact, really pronounces his in his philosophy of Hinduism as to how much of Hinduism, inter alia Brahminism, is a political notebook that one needs to examine by really rusticating or rescuing it from the hegemonic ideas of religion. Now, Brahminism, since its origin, has always operated, and we know the history, in disguise, erasure, murder, stealing, and misappropriation. And each of these words can be independently written as a chapter on its own. What were the misappropriations? What kind of stealings? What kind of erasure? What kind of murder? But two effective examples of this could be related, of course, the revolution, counter-revolution that is often talked about through the rise of Buddhism, and of course the Shramana tradition, the Shramnik tradition, which eventually are today assimilated as Hindu tradition, which really existed contradictory to the Brahminic ethos that we understand. So what then? The question really remains: is Brahminism what offered it's an extended life? I think it's the easy assimilation of Brahminism into the canon of Hindutva, and replacing it with the politics of Brahminism as a philosophy of Hinduism. And it really became easy for the Shramanic tradition to be incorporated as Hinduism. It no longer could be identified as a Brahminism, and yet Brahmins continue to dominate. And you look across the project, even of the liberal order is controlled by the Brahmins. You talk about XYZ liberal, look at the caste status, and it's always this Savarna hegemony that sits at the center of any kind of politics of liberation that it comes. But from a Dalit viewpoint, these two extremes are unhelpful, especially the extremes of Muslim and Hindu, especially the extremes of religion, especially the extreme of this historic divide, which is very much modern located. Dalits really identified themselves as inheritors of the Harappan civilization that is located in present-day Pakistan, but also the Dravidian example that really creates a race-based idea, which not necessarily people usually misunderstand this race-based idea as something to be done with phenotypical, but it is mostly done with cultural and as well as linguistic differences. My colleague here at Harvard really has excavated through the linguistic of how the othering was really part of the linguistic formulations. Finally, what we need to also in this bifurcation, we need to understand that once Brahminism received a spiritual sanction in the name of Hinduism from the colonial authority, Hinduism easily assimilated the original purpose of Brahminism operating as Hindutva. Therefore, Hindutva is a colonial product of Brahmins who was well suited to the project of empire and its control. So the original nature of Brahminism, as I've already said, relied on the parity of impurity. The logic of purity emanated from the morbid fears. There was a fear of Chandal semen, Chandal blood, and Chandal saliva. The whole, and this is where we need to understand how Brahminism is in operation. It has created, and throughout the research, the Ashraf Musalmans and the Savarna Hindus have really worked in cahoots to create this permanent victimhood in the subaltern castes across India by really giving them only two identities, either of Hindu or either of Muslim. And the Shramanic tradition that really existed really was not given scope. Even today, when we have to talk about, we talk about minority representative of a Muslim and here, if you account to minority as a numerical representation or even a communal representation, same status is not accorded to Adivasis or Dalits, because they are still considered as the subset or subordinate subjects that cannot exist independent of Hinduism. And this has been the fight of 100+ years. And so what we really need to understand is this fear of Chandal, their semen, their blood and saliva gave rise to the protected citizenship of Agraharas. And today, the whole idea of Akhand Bharat is an Akhand Agrahara. It's to create these zones of purities based on one's complexes of what culture, what caste one belongs to. The desire to create or recreate a spatial homeland of segregated nationalities, it requires the participation of majority. You can't create a nation on minority, and thus the demographic cleavages were used and continues to be used. And today, when we are asking for a census as to see how apartheid India is functioning, we don't have the numbers. Even if we scratch from the data that we don't have yet, we look through the few surveys, there is a fear that the majority consensus is actually representative of a minority's hegemonic position. And hegemony here operates also in the idea of knowledge production. So we really need to see the Hindutva as a machine that is primarily relying on elimination of anything to do with Dalit existence, because Dalit has always contested. Dalit is today understood in a different context. Obviously, as we know, I'm contrasting this with the Shramanic tradition, the traditions belonging and eventually belonging to original notion of refusal or revolution that was brought out, as opposed to the counter-revolution of Brahminism. And thus, I think what we need to do is a narrative that has been constantly created where Musalman is identified as an invasive force, which becomes a unifying factor for the Shramanak or the traditions who belong to the non-Muslim or non-Hindu category, but then making them easily Hindu. So I propose, whenever we talk about Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, let us not give the minority Brahmins, minority Baniyas to occupy a mythical majoritarian position. Let them talk through their caste position. If a Brahmin is espousing a Hindutva, we should call it as a Brahminwad or a Brahminism. Let us not assume the political majoritarian view, which is, of course, one can deal with when it comes to the political demography. But if we intellectually analyze this through sensitivity of history, we might be able to give the independent cultures that were mischievously forced by the colonial authorities to be assimilated. And we need to make it a minority project as opposed to the project of a majority. Because even if we take about elections, Modi even got to power close to 30%. The majority of them were not there. And let's also be sensitive to the Dalit political spheres, be it BSP, be it VCK or other Dalit political parties who really stand in contrast to the entire project. And I've already argued, and many of my so-called radical friends, Savarna radical friends, Savarna communists, one of a very confusing species that exist among the South Asian scholars, really irritated by me saying the Hindu Muslimization of India has really worked against any kind of political progress that we want to assume, because even the actual empire of the Turks, where even today is present a poor Muslim, which is converted Muslim from the subaltern caste, is made to realize that you are part of a certain regime of coming from Turk or Central Asia, needs to be really foregrounded with the idea of, if you may call it indigeneity, but something that will isolate the zoned caste groups and cornering them accordingly. It is no accident that Brahmins continue to occupy, even if the 40% of India's national income is single-handedly controlled by one caste group, which is Brahmin. And Brahmin themselves have 1,550 subcastes. So I think let that sink in, how subcaste works in this space as well. And I submit to you that Hindutva needs to be brought to the fore, not by saying that Dalits are the participants of Hindutva, but by saying Dalits are made the victims of Hindutva, not least by colonial, but also by the Savarna Hindus and Ashraf Musalmans, to create a dichotomy that serves the purpose to eradicate anything to do with the subaltern rise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suraj. Those are important and I think incredibly useful reflections that ought to be taken up not only by the world of politics, but also by the world of scholarship, so that we can delve a little deeper into the ways in which the formation of the Muslim and the reformation of Hindutva can be both emancipatory projects for current regimes in India. So thank you so much for these reflections. We will now, sorry, my scroll has unscrolled itself. But please, Audrey, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all my panelists and co-panelists and to everyone for being here, and especially warm thanks to Rohit for organizing all of this. So the title of my paper today is Caste Control Towards a Frank Reckoning of Who Represents Hinduism in History. So basically what I want to do is among many other things in life. But right now, I want to think about how caste, often Brahmanical hegemony, specifically mediates who gets to represent and claim Hinduism at specific points in history. And I'm specifically interested in pre-modernity. That's partly because of my training and general inclinations, but also because it is comparatively understudied and it presents different issues than for modernity. And one issue worth flagging at the outset is that, in my opinion, it is more difficult in certain ways to access non-elite perspectives for pre-modernity. Okay, we have to work and think about how to work creatively and honestly with the sources that we do have available for understanding pre-modern Hindu traditions. Now, I've not quite yet figured out how to do that. So what I'm going to offer here to you all is a set of 4 fragments that sort of look at different aspects of how caste mediates what we claim to know about pre-modern Hindu traditions and who counts as Hindu. So fragment 1, the Brahmin firewall. I have absolutely no idea how to write about Hindu traditions in the early century CE. So this is about 2000 to 1500 years ago from a lower caste perspective. As we have it at present in the historiography, this is basically a straight up Brahmanical story. So think of dharma, a core, if obviously not an exclusive, Hindu concept. If you want to know what dharma was about 2000 years ago, you could look at the Dharma Shastra texts, specifically the Dharma Sutras. You might look to the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Dharma is not quite as key of a concept in Vedic texts, but you could try. You could look at the Upanishads or even the Brahmanas or some other slightly later Vedic connected work. Now, I just listed a whole bunch of Sanskrit texts. Every single one of those was authored by upper caste men and gives us a decidedly upper caste male perspective. Now, if I have any Sanskritists in the audience, especially warm welcome, but also you might object, especially vis-a-vis the epics, that they cannot be so easily reduced to a single viewpoint. I would agree. There are diverse perspectives therein, but I'm not so sure that they're diverse in terms of caste. We can find passages about lower caste individuals like Shambhuka in the Ramayana or Ekalavya in the Mahabharata, but there's nothing clearly by or from the point of view of a lower caste person. Now, at a slightly later date, the Mahabharata gets dubbed the 5th Veda, okay, specifically the Veda for women and for Shudras. Now, this is a slightly later idea. It doesn't go back 2000 years, but still consider the inbuilt exclusion. There is no point in pre-modern Indian history, or frankly, in modern Indian history, where the 4 Vedas are intended for the ears of the majority of Hindus. They're always delimited, in theory anyways, by gender and by caste. Fragment 2, is caste Hindu? So that question, is caste Hindu, provokes great modern anxiety. Rather than answer it, I want to point out that that tension is entirely a modern phenomenon. If we could put the query to, say, Manu, the purported author of a foundational work of Sanskrit ethics, Dharma Shastra, right? And he was writing around the 2nd to 3rd century CE. Manu would answer with a proud and resounding, yes, absolutely, caste is our dharma. Manu elaborated his core thesis over hundreds of pages of Sanskrit, and his basic thesis is that all men are created unequal. Each has their own duty as per a hereditary social class. So Shudras serve, Vaishyas farm, Kshatriyas govern and fight. But Manu reserves most of his attention and essentially all of his admiration for Brahmins, the creme de la creme of humanity in his worldview. He discourses on the excellence of the Brahmin. He issues repeated variations on the maxim, and I quote, Brahmins should be honored in every way, for they are the highest deity. Is this Hinduism? Now, Manu would not have used that term, and I'll come to why in a moment. But if we could explain the modern term Hinduism to Manu, how would he answer? He wouldn't answer me at all, as both both because I'm a woman and I'm a Videshi. Okay, so I'm just going to skim over Manu's extreme misogyny here. But ignoring that, I think Manu would answer yes, that adherence to a pyramid-like caste system that champions inequality is Hinduism. But that's Manu. Should we call this Hinduism? If we're talking about Manu's religious ideas, then yes, I think we should. To be honest, to the past, no matter how upsetting it is in our present. But what about other groups' religious practices? Because my friends, Manu was not the only man in town. So fragment 3, can rejecting caste be Hindu? Pre-modern Hindus did not usually call themselves Hindu. As all pre-modern scholars know, Hindu is a Perso-Arabic term that in pre-modernity referred to residents of India as often as it referred to practitioners of a religious tradition. Hindus only began to refer to themselves as such regularly and widely in the 19th century. Even sporadic self-referential uses of the term Hindu only date back to the 14th century at the earliest. Now, the absence of a term is not the absence of a thing. But the disconnect in vocabulary means that when scholars or anybody else talks about Hindus and Hinduism before about 1800, we have to define at the outset who we include within that identity and tradition. Many academics use caste norms to make that determination. So for instance, a brilliant colleague of mine and of all of us, Elaine Fisher, noted in her 2017 book that early Shaivas rejected the Vedas and they did not honor Varnashrama Dharma, and all the time they were engaging in non-Brahmanical practices. And as a result, she argued that Shaivism, and I quote, during this formative period was functionally independent from any parent religion we may wish to describe as Hinduism. I concur with Dr. Fisher as a matter of scholarly practice. But if we take a step back, it seems to me that we are collectively promoting a Hinduism as defined by caste privilege viewpoints and then excluding those who dissent. What would happen if we were to rethink that circular logic? I think probably what would happen is we would confront problems in the present. Some among an earlier generation of scholars were absolutely lambasted by the Hindu right for their interest in the Vama, the left-hand parts of pre-modern Hindu traditions that, among other things, frequently disregarded caste boundaries. But academically, why not? Why not consider a more diverse array of texts and practices within pre-modern Hindu traditions instead of assuming the definitional primacy of Brahmanical purity and hegemony? The answer to that question of why not is that to do so, to say, call the early Shaivas Hindu, would change the narrative of the history of Hinduism to which we are all accustomed. I think it would change it quite a lot. And I don't know if we're all ready for that. Fragment 4, modernity at last. So when all of us really, but especially when I speak about pre-modern Hinduism, I do so most often from within the United States, okay, complete with an Indian American diaspora that is several million strong and growing. Indian Americans are the most upper caste community that have ever existed. Okay, as many of you know, their demographics skew heavily upper caste overall as compared to Indian residents as a group. And that's due to two combined things. One is US immigration policies that heavily favor skilled migrants from South Asia, coupled with caste inequalities built up over generations. Now, some within the Indian American community push back against scholars like me, who want to diversify our study of South Asian history and Hinduism. And I want to say two things to contextualize that pushback. One is that in seeking to describe a broader, more diverse history of Hinduism, I am cutting against the personal experiences of many within the upper caste dominated Indian American diaspora. Now, that's not a problem for me because I'm not trying to describe the histories of diasporic American Hinduism alone. Often I'm not trying to describe that sort of Hinduism at all. And so here we all do need to check our modern biases. any one person's Hinduism in 21st century America cannot and should not exert control over the recovery of Hinduisms in the Indian past. Two is there's the modern issue of caste. Right, you all know caste is not confined to the dustbin of history, rather it's a present day issue as well. Studies show that many Indian Americans identify with and continue caste practices, including through marriage restrictions, right, which is one of the bedrocks of the hereditary caste system. Recent high-profile cases, like the raid on a Baptist temple in southern New Jersey that found dozens of Dalit indentured servants, make it painfully clear that caste-based oppression is an American problem. I think that the ire that frank discussions of caste can arouse is perhaps prompted by the fear that seeing caste prejudice in the past may highlight its persistence in our present. So in very brief conclusion, caste control in the past and in the present has exerted, in my opinion, too great of an influence on the academic study of pre-modern Hinduism. I want to try for a different narrative that is more honest to the past, even while it remains highly challenging in our present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I think in your fragments you point very importantly to the work that Dr. Ambedkar would frame as an ontological critique of forms of knowledge. And I think here, both in thinking about what the current world, what pressures it put on those of us who study deep Indian past, has to be taken into account as we begin to kind of reframe those conversations. It's my great pleasure now to finally turn to Chinnaiah. Please go ahead. You have the floor. And I do want to remind our audience that please use the Q&A function to submit any questions you have for any of our speakers, and we'll look forward to having an engaged conversation. Chinnaiah, please.
Thank you, Manan, and also Rohit, and also fellow panelists, and Rohit particularly for inviting me for this, exciting conference, and so far, it's really exciting. We are all in this together, particularly fighting the Hindu fascism, and I think these conversations are excellent in terms of, to build this critical tradition of, undoing the undemocratic fascism which is raising in India. And I think as diaspora, we are very important to have these conversations, not only to fight fascism, but also democratize and, enhance the critical traditions which existed in India. So in this context, I really, it's really fascinating from Suraj to everyone, the kind of things you guys have said, and also how these things are happening. So in this context, given the theme of the conference, I thought, I will start with this idea of public sphere, which, we all are familiar with in terms of Habermas, and also, how Ambedkar, for example, in the context of, the way just now Manan talked about the ontological critique of forms of knowledge of Ambedkar, particularly in terms of historical knowledge. And I would like to take you all back to the, see the whole idea of anti-caste critique, and also how the anti-caste critique as a parallel to the Brahminical dominant ideological tradition exists. So in this context, when we look at the idea of public sphere, and what you see is that, if you take it from, long history of Brahminical evolution from Vedic time to all the way up to, modern age, one of the important things is that, caste is very critical to the idea of development of public sphere, particularly in pre-modern India. And in that context, what you see is that, in this public sphere, particularly Vedic time, like, if you look at the ancient texts and also read about ancient Brahminical development, one of the important thing is that, the way in which it constructed the space was through rituals and sacrifices. And that's how basically the political class, the rulers got the legitimacy. So in this context, when rituals and sacrifices are very critical to the idea of making up the state formation, one of the important thing is that it also depended on the idea of, So both social hierarchy, exploitation, and exclusion, to preserve the monopoly of the power in the hands of the rulers and the Brahmins. So in this context, what happens is that, the evolution of Brahminical ideology as a state ideology, one of the important thing is that, the caste exclusion is very, very critical to the idea of public space and political power. So in this context, what we see is that, we see very interesting limitation of the idea of public sphere, which developed by people like Habermas, which actually takes only 18th and 19th century as a very important aspect in terms of European idea of public sphere. But in the context of pre-modern India, not pre-modern South Asia, what you see is that, public sphere is very critical in construction of state and also public space, in which basically exclusion becomes very, very important part of it. And, as earlier papers were talking about, like both Ananya and, even Audrey, and one of the important things you see is that, how Brahmanism is very, very, very creative in terms of the way in which it tries to hold on to the powerful sections of society, using both as a ritual power and also material advantages. So in this context, what I see is that, the idea of public sphere is very, very critical in terms of the state power and the way in which Brahminical hegemony develops over the periods of history. And in this context, what you see is that, this is where the Buddhism and Jainism, the intervention of Buddhism and Jainism, one of the important things is that, it breaks that idea of exclusion as a very, very important aspect. So in this context, what happens is that, I'm talking from the, sphere of Deccan, particularly, Satavahana Empire, and where, recently I'm reading very extensively in terms of, writing about history of Telugu literature in the context of what the translation I did. I was fascinated by these pre-modern empires, particularly Satavahana Empire, which was known for both Buddhist and Jain traditions, and most of the rulers were patronizing. So in this context, what you see is that, I think it is Jain and Buddhist. These were the two important traditions which makes religion as a public space, in which basically what you see is that, inviting people from across castes and communal worship becomes very important. And with this, what you see that, Buddhism and Jainism open up this anti-Brahminical tradition of ethic of inclusion, from exclusion to inclusion. So in this context, what happens is that, when they do this public space, like particularly if you look at places like both in Andhra and Telangana, most of the Hindu temples, which were former Jain and Buddhist temples. And what they were known for is that, the communal gathering of the people. And that's why what you see is that, Buddhist stupas or temples, what they become is that, they become symbols of this inclusion as a very, very important thing. And another important thing, what you see is that along with Prakrit and Sanskrit, and it is Buddhist Jain traditions, which become very important in terms of early evolution of regional languages. Particularly, I can tell Kannada and Telugu, for example. And in fact, I'm reading this very fascinating story about the birth of Telugu language. And the Adikavi Nannaya, basically the person who was supposed to be the father of Telugu language was known as Adikavi Nannaya, and who in 11th century, 10th and 11th century, was the first one to start the translation of Mahabharata into Telugu. But actually what happens, the very interesting story about this person is that when the Chalukyan emperor, who used to be a Jain, and when he, with the influence of Brahmanism, when he becomes, traces his origins to Pandavas, and he requests Nannaya to translate Sanskrit Mahabharata into Telugu. And when he requests, calls everyone to come forward to translate, one of the Jain scholar was the earliest person to translate the Mahabharata into Telugu. And that comes, his name is Atharvana. Atharvana shows the manuscript translated by him to Nannaya, and Nannaya gets very, very worried that, this translation is very superior compared to what I'm planning to do. And what this Nannaya does is that, he burns the manuscript on the house of the Jain scholar. And that's so basically what you see, that the very idea of translation of Mahabharata in Telugu, the Telugu language, it starts with this Brahminical reaction against the Jain translations of Mahabharata. So in this context, what you see is that, this what Ambedkar said about revolution and counter-revolution, and the way in which Brahmanism comes back against this Buddhist tradition is very critical even in terms of the language. And with this, what you see is that, like again, Brahmanism is one of the important thing is that, when it tries to emerge, particularly after 12th century onwards in places like Telangana, Andhra, Deccan regions, or even in Kannada, other places, one of the important thing is that, again, the former Buddhist and Jain temples becomes very important centers of, again, Brahmanism. And in which, again, what you see is that, the exclusion of lower caste, particularly the so-called lower caste, Dalits and Sudras particularly, becomes very, very important. So in this context, what you see is that, again, the Vedic sacrifices and reassertion of Varna Dharma becomes very critical to the idea of evolution of, regional kingdoms, both in, particularly in Telugu states. So with this, what you see is that, and again, the translation projects, and particularly epics, both, epics and Puranas are very, very important in terms of development of languages. And what these translations have done is that, they legitimize Brahmanism. So with this, what you see is that, the way in which, even, for example, Audrey talked about Shaivism being anti-caste. To begin with, what you see is that, the entire Shaivism reaction against, Jainism is very critical in terms of development of the Vachana tradition, particularly in Kannada, for example, the Vachanas which speak against Brahmanism and also misogyny. And what you see is that, eventually both critical Shaiva and Vaishnava traditions get, absorbed by this Vedic tradition. So in this context, what you see is that, this tension, particularly both in the evolution of textual traditions and also religious spaces as public spaces, is very, very critical to the idea of evolution of what you call the public sphere. So in this context, what we see is that, particularly Dalit and other oppressed sections of society always contested this inegalitarian Brahmanical tradition. And what you see is that, it is their exclusion which becomes very critical to the idea of supremacy of Brahmanism and Brahmin supremacy. So in this context, what you see is that, particularly both Sanskrit and also Sanskritized regional traditions rely on these exclusions as and reconstruction of public space, both around political power and also temples as the centers in which basically the elite gather and elites have exclusory monopoly over them. So in this context, what you see is that, so the anti-caste egalitarian tradition, particularly of both Dalit and Shudra communities, remains as a parallel tradition. So that's why what happens is that at one level, like what we see in terms of Veerashaiva tradition, at one level it counters Brahmanism, but also it is in dialogue with Brahmanism. And what you see that, it is here again what is that illiterate and also oral traditions of Dalits, which basically, are excluded from the mainstream Brahmanical tradition. In this, what you see is that, local gods and goddesses particularly are very, anti-Brahmanical, and also they try to subvert the idea of Brahmanical idea of religion. And also particularly if you look at most of the local goddesses in villages, for example, they are all unmarried. Most of them, particularly lower caste goddesses, do not have husbands. And it's a very interesting thing, like, how Brahmanism, patriarchy is very critical to the idea of Brahmanism. But in local tradition, what you see is that, women goddesses never get married. Even men, for that matter. In fact, there is this very interesting tradition called Potarajulu. There are 7 sisters and 2 brothers. All of them never marry in life. And that's how basically what you see is that, this whole idea of, subverting the idea of Brahmanical patriarchy is very, very critical. So in this context, by 17th century, what you see is that, like Shudra saints like Potulu River Brahma, particularly influenced by both Shaivism and Shaivism, what they do is that, they develop this parallel idea of anti-caste religions, in which basically talking against Brahmanism becomes very, very important. And he basically leads this very important, movement of Dalit and Shudras, and which actually what happens is that he developed this yoga teachers, kind of yoga spiritual teachers like Bandikutla Veerama, a Dalit woman, becomes very important champion of anti-casteism, in particular present day Rayalaseema and also Andhra. So in this context, what they do is that, this whole parallel tradition survives with untouchable communities like Madigas. So in this context, when, for example, in American Baptist missions come in 19th century, one of the important things is that, as Ananya was telling, like even in Andhra, they try to convert Brahmins and other upper caste in the beginning. All these Protestant missionaries were obsessed to convert Brahmins and other upper caste. But what happens is that they miserably fail. And what they do is that then they rely on untouchables. Like, for example, you see the picture of this person. He was the first untouchable convert into American Baptist mission. And by the time American Baptist mission start coming from Coromandel coast up into the inlands, what you see is that this anti-caste movements of Dalits is already very vibrant. And what they do is that they go and basically start having conversations with person like Peraya, and ultimately he leads this entire community into this American Baptist mission. That's why what you see that even now, if you go and see in both in Andhra and Rayalaseema areas, you see that entire American Baptist missions basically rely on this Madiga community, and which becomes very, very important in terms of both anti-caste politics and also in terms of developing afterwards the Dalit movement. So with this, what we are seeing is that, this whole idea of, again, by the time colonial public sphere comes in, what you see is that, again, the way in which Brahminism and colonialism, it is together, they produce this political Hinduism. That, like, as Suraj pointed out, and also Ananya was telling, like how Brahmins become very critical in terms of the colonial reassertion and the way in which they try to in the larger context of colonialism, Brahminism is a very, very critical idea. And what you see, that's one of the reasons I think the book I'm writing, what I try to argue is that caste is a template for settler colonialism across the world. Because caste, what it does is that it provides a very interesting intellectual genesis for the idea of racism. And we cannot understand, you cannot untangle racism in modern world unless you see the connection it has with the Brahmanism. That's why what you see that either Portuguese or English, French or Dutch, what you see is that they have a very interesting fascination with the Brahmins. In fact, Brahmins are not producers of any materials which they are exporting the world markets, right? Like Brahmins do not weave, Brahmins do not produce spices, but still they are very, very critical players in terms of colonial powers. But actually, the actual producers of neither cotton textiles or spices, they are not seen as important game changers for colonialism. But it is Brahminism, Brahmins, which becomes very important. So in this context, you see that the way in which the modern world evolves, and the way in which the caste gets understood and refurbished by the both Portuguese and other colonial powers in terms of giving Varna as a caste and also transforming Jatis into different castes. What you see is that you see this very interesting alliance is happening between the dominant upper caste and also Brahminical classes with the the colonial powers. So in this context, what you see is that like Dalits and also anti-caste imaginaries continues to remain outside the political power, in which basically, that's so Ambedkar, for example, always remained outside the power of the Brahmanism. So in this context, what you see is that there was this continuous tension between the caste supremacy of the Brahmanism and the anti-caste imagination of the Dalits across the periods in history. I will stop it here. We'll have. Thank you so much, and Jai Bhim again.
Thank you so much, Chinnaiah.